Welcome to Medtech Digital Week, brought to you by the organizers of the Medtech series. My name is Filippo. I will be your host for today's session titled Navigating Regulatory Affairs and Ensuring Compliance in a Medtech Scale-Up. First, I will cover some quick housekeeping items. If you experience difficulties with audio or advancing slides, refresh your screen with F5. If you are experiencing other issues, hit the question mark button to receive assistance. At any time during the presentation, submit your question to the Q&A window on the left-hand side of your screen. In 24 hours, you will receive a link to watch the recording of this session. Let's now begin by introducing our speaker from Matrix Requirements, Anne Van Krugh-Elsben, RA and QA Manager. Thank you for joining us today, Anne. And now we'll hand it over to you to begin the presentation.
Thank you very much, Filippo, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me today. So during this webinar, I will talk about what is important to build a regulatory strategy in the different phases of a company. So meaning the pre-funding phase where you have an idea, you work out, and you have to convince people to invest and support your idea. Secondly, in the pre-market phase, where you go and develop your product and prepare everything to bring your device to the market. And then thirdly, once you have already a device on the market and you perhaps want to change your device, make adjustments, add new devices to your portfolio or target different markets. In all of these different phases, having a regulatory strategy is important. So very shortly about myself. So my name is Anne Van Krugh-Elsben. I'm based in Belgium. I have a background in bioengineering, and in the past 10 years something, I've been active in regulatory affairs and quality assurance in medical device companies, which means that I've been working with everything from startup companies up to multinationals. So I've seen many different ways of dealing with regulatory strategies. So first of all, when thinking about a regulatory strategy for bringing medical devices to the market, it's important to realize that there are many different inputs to the development of such products. So first of all, it's important to well define the intended use. So as a manufacturer, what do you want to bring to the market? Which problem do you want to solve? For who? And so who is your intended user, your intended patient population, the intended environment? Which product claims, which marketing claims do you want to make for the product? That is actually the basis for a lot of your regulatory planning, because that will actually, first of all, define whether or not your product is considered to be a medical device or something else. And assuming that we're talking about medical devices as well, what are the requirements in terms of testing, in terms of documentation, what is needed to get your product to the market? It all starts with defining that intended use and the claims related to your product. Secondly, it's also important to think about what are the expectations from your users. Is this a completely new technology that will change the way of working in a certain procedure, for example? Or is this a known technology? And is that technology or the habits, the things that your users are used to do, is it the same for every market that you want to target? Or perhaps one market has a specific way of dealing with this medical problem where your device will fit into, and another market has a different approach. That's also important to know when you're going to plan how to manage and prioritize the development efforts. And then thirdly, of course, what are the markets that you want to target? Which markets do you want to enter? And what are the requirements per region? Because each region will have its own set of requirements. You have heavily regulated regions, you have regions where there's little to none regulation. It's important to know what are the differences and what are the overlapping requirements per region so that you can actually plan and prioritize, also knowing the timelines of how long it takes to bring a device to a certain market is important to know so that you can actually build that regulatory strategy in the most efficient way. And therefore, it's important to actually start thinking about this, about a regulatory strategy or a regulatory program from the start and in close collaboration with development, so that you can actually have this strategy serve as a guidance or a blueprint for your development efforts as well. Of course, it's also important to realize that the regulatory strategy will change over time. The regulations might change, your company might change, your product might change. So this is not a one-time effort to build a strategy and that blueprint will serve for the rest of the lifetime of a certain device. No, things will change over time, so you need to be flexible and adapt and change your planning during the life cycle of a certain device. The change that we all know very well, going from the Medical Device Directive to a Medical Device Regulation in Europe, is a good example. There were new requirements introduced in different aspects of medical devices. So it's important to know that and to adjust and adapt your planning to this. So in order to build a successful regulatory strategy, you have to keep the end in mind. Which claims do I want to make in the end? Which markets or which target regions do I have? And what are the requirements? And knowing those end goals allows to define a good regulatory strategy from the start of the development process. So we will have to think about what are the requirements. And as I said, these are driven by, first of all, the intended use of your product and the markets that you want to target. So every region has its own regulation, has its own set of requirements. But what most jurisdictions have in common is that they take a risk-based approach when defining criteria or requirements to bring a product to the market. That means that when you have a low-risk device, in general, there will be less requirements than for high-risk devices. And again, that all comes back to what are the claims that I'm making? What is my intended use? And what are the risks or the safety concerns related to the use of my device? So I'm saying it's important to know which are my target markets, which regions in the world do I want to enter. And so it's important to know where to start. And actually, the first thing to do, for as far as the information is, of course, available in a language you understand, the best source is to go to the website of the national competent authorities for specific requirements linked to the regions that you want to target. So for market clearance, for market approval, it's best to go to the national authorities of the countries that you want to target. Of course, that's not always easy. And in some cases, the information is difficult to find or less available. In that case, you can, of course, also work with consultants if possible. There is also the IMDRF. Many countries have adopted the IMDRF classification rules, and IMDRF stands for International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And this is a group of regulators from all over the world that tries to harmonize requirements regarding medical devices. And they publish many valuable guidance documents on their website. However, it's not because a country is member of the IMDRF that they cannot have their own national or regional requirements. So it's still important, even though you might have a member country of the IMDRF or a country that actually follows the guidances of this IMDRF group, that you should not investigate local requirements. I've put here on the slide as well what are the current members. So this is Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, the EU, Japan, Russia, Singapore, South Korea, UK, and the USA. So the guidance documents will keep in mind the requirements of those countries, but as said, doesn't mean that you cannot have some specific additional requirements. So once you have investigated that, region per region, you can think about planning. And there are actually two main pillars to consider. You have the product documentation and you have the quality management system. And also here, there is one common basis. There is this risk-based approach. So depending on the classification of your product, there will be more or less requirements for your product documentation. And actually the same is true for your quality management system. It will really depend on your product as well, which kind of procedures you need to establish. But there is, of course, always a minimum requirement. So when we think about the product documentation, so a medical device product file, technical file, design history file, design dossier. This is the documentation, the file that you compile in order to submit to either an authority or a notified body, somebody that will review your file and give you approval to bring the product to the market. Here are some basic common requirements which will come back in every region, and you will see things like risk management, design control, labeling, and labeling is actually something that will probably be specific for the region that you're targeting. The testing, so validation, verification, manufacturing, and then of course the procedures that guide all of these activities. So the ultimate goal of a medical device product file is to describe the device and to provide evidence that all aspects of the device are under the control of the manufacturer, so that you can actually convince your reviewers, the ones that have to give you approval, that you are bringing a safe and performant device to the market. That is the end goal of a legislation, to make sure that safe and performant medical devices are being brought to the market. So when you think about the different phases of a company, at start, you will not have your manufacturing line ready. You will not have products to be tested. You will focus first on the design control, the risk management. You have to make sure that you know what is expected in terms of clinical studies and first verification and validation efforts. So that is also what needs to be first established in your quality management system as well. It's also important when we think about targeting multiple regions to understand the requirements there. Do I have to conduct studies in different regions? Do I have to have my manufacturing site inspected? How long in advance do I need to plan for that? Who will have to inspect it? Is that the authority? Is that a notified body? Are there specific requirements for test labs? For example, European authorities might not accept test reports from Chinese labs unless they have specific accreditations. All of that is important to know. And it remains important. It doesn't matter whether it's the first product that that you bring to the market, or it's the fifth product you bring to the market. Depending on the regional requirements, you have to take these things into account every time. The second pillar was the quality management system. Now, a quality management system as a whole aims to provide a framework for the manufacturer to ensure that you know what to do in order to bring a medical device to the market and to ensure that it's safe and performant. The scope and the complexity of a quality management system can vary, and that's depending on the product classification as well. Now, in general, the ISO 13485 gives you a good standard requirement for a quality management system. Nevertheless, in some regions, there are different requirements. And also, you have ISO 13485, which describes in general requirements for a quality management system, and you can be certified for that. But still, depending on the region, you will have to have some of the procedures adapted to the local requirements, or you might need additional procedures to cover local requirements. So once you know the regional requirements for bringing product to the market, and you have a plan on how to develop your quality management system and your documentation, it's really important to make sure that you cover everything and that you don't forget part of that documentation. So it's important to make a mapping. It's sometimes not that straightforward to know, it's easier to know region per region what are the requirements, but it's not something that you want to do in parallel. You don't want to have a completely separate set for one region and then the second region and so on, because there will be a lot of overlap and a lot of double work. And then afterwards, when you have to adapt something, if you want to make changes to your product, there will be a lot of duplication in the work, and it's very prone to errors. So it's important to make that mapping of both the similarities and the differences in requirements for every region that you want to target. And I'm coming back to the IMDRF. They do have a table of content, which is actually a very good starting point, and they have 2 of them. So you can look online, it's available for free for the table of content for device market authorizations. And they have one for non-in vitro diagnostic products and one for in vitro diagnostic products. And actually what it does is it gives you an overview of all kinds of documents that you are expected to create and to supply for market authorizations, with then specific guidances on requirements of their members, their member countries. So that is a good starting point to start doing that mapping. Again, it's still important to look back to all the information that you can find regarding the national requirements. So it's really important not to forget that. And that is true for both the product documentation as well as the quality management system documentation. So when we look back at what we've covered so far, so you know your target regions, you know the requirements, you have an idea on how to plan this, you know the requirements then in terms of documentation. Then the question is, how can we manage it all within a medtech company? And there, it's important to realize that this regulatory strategy, this whole planning, it doesn't only exist within the regulatory department. This whole strategy affects actually every department within the company. It's really part of the puzzle, and that regulatory strategy will affect, for example, marketing in terms of the claims that that were defined, but that can also be made in their documentation. Okay, regulatory affairs, of course, because they will first of all drive this whole strategy. They will make sure that the research is done in terms of requirements, and they will, from their side, from their perspective, do a project planning in terms of what can be prioritized, what is needed, what are the best approaches to target certain markets, what can be done easier or what will take more time, and that directly affects as well, for example, sales, so that they can actually prioritize or see what can be done depending on the efforts that are needed to enter certain markets. QA, quality assurance, of course, the whole quality management system aspect, what needs to be adapted, which processes are missing for certain regions, do we need additional procedures, do we need to adapt procedures? That is all directly linked as well to this regulatory strategy. The manufacturing, as mentioned, when you are developing a medical device and you transfer to manufacturing, there is also a need to validate that. It's important to know for each region what are the requirements to have your manufacturing line accepted, what is needed in terms of testing, so the verification validation before transferring to manufacturing, but also afterwards. Engineering, so the direct link with development, as I mentioned at the start, your regulatory strategy will serve as a guidance, as a blueprint for your development activities as well. And of course, clinical studies will be performed before bringing device to the market, but also afterwards. And what are the specific requirements per region? In some cases, it might be that you have to do studies, excuse me, studies in the different regions. In some cases, certain regions accept studies performed in other regions. It's all something that needs to be defined in that strategy. Also the frequency of having to redo certain clinical studies or evaluations is something to consider. Again, not only the first time you want to bring a product to the market, but as well afterwards. So that brings me to what is important to consider at the different phases of a company. So you have the very early stage, the pre-funding stage. So you have an ID, you develop your IDs, you know that you want to target a specific problem, you want to create a solution for that. The first thing to do is to create that intended use and really know what you want to claim. What are the performance claims? So what will your product do? What are the marketing claims? And you have to realize what is the impact of this. If I have certain claims for my product, it might actually be that you, first of all, it will define which legislation is applicable. It will define what standards might be applicable. It will also dictate in which classification you will end up and what the requirements will be. So it's really important to know at that stage what you want to do, because it will impact everything what will follow afterwards. Secondly, you also need to have a very good idea about the initial global markets that you wish to target. Having considered all of that and having an initial plan and idea for that will help you to convince others to invest in your idea and in your project as well. It shows that you know how to tackle this sometimes difficult aspect of regulatory affairs, regulatory requirements, and that you know what is expected in the future of you as a manufacturer to bring your device to the target markets of your choice. When we think about the pre-market phase, so that means that you have convinced people to invest in you and that you are one step further, so you are actually going to develop a medical device. Here it's important to convert those regulatory requirements and integrate them in your design input. Design input is not only defining some user needs meaning the actual users and their needs. Regulatory requirements are also part of that design input. This is also the phase where you really start to plan and prioritize the market submissions. In some cases, in order to enter some markets, it will take a lot more time than other markets. So it might be more beneficial to target other markets first and then in parallel work on the longer submissions. And that again really depends on which markets and what kind of product you have. It's also very important not to forget about the quality management system. I've seen before that in some cases the development of the procedures comes with a little bit of delay. And that's a pity because while you are developing your product, you need to make sure that you have control over the design and the development of your product, that you do that documentation in the correct way. So it's better to invest time and resources in the development of that quality management system, or at least certain aspects of it from the start. So design control, risk management, also something that will heavily impact the development process. Knowing what is expected in terms of clinical studies, having your test procedures in place so that once you are at the point that you can start testing, even if it's not the final test yet, that you know what is required in terms of testing. That is important, and that should not happen too late either. So, and then you will have to prepare your documentation, taking into account country-specific requirements. So by that I mean that it's not only the general description, it might be some applicable standards, and definitely the labels, the instructions for use. There you will have some country-specific requirements. Also, in terms of files to be submitted, it can be that you have additional documents depending on the region that need to be submitted as well. And then there is the third phase for a company. That's when you have already a product on the market and you are considering to either enter new markets or change your claims, have additional claims, or completely change them, changes to the products as well. All of those aspects, so changing target markets, adding new markets, creating other claims, and so on, they will directly impact your regulatory strategy. Actually, it will just trigger an update of your regulatory strategy. If you want to enter new markets, you start again with mapping what are the similarities in requirements, what are the differences in requirements, what are the timelines, how can we manage this with our existing timelines. So it's a whole project planning, depending on what are the new markets and their own requirements. When you want to change claims, it's important to know, does that affect my classification? And you have to do that exercise for every region where you're active with that device. It might be that in some regions you go to a higher classification, in other regions it might not make a difference. So it's really important to know what needs to be done. And when thinking about this, that's where the mapping becomes very important, because if you have overlapping requirements and they start to deviate because of certain changes, it's also important to know what is impacted in your documentation. Maybe for some countries, all of a sudden you will have to have additional tests, while in others not. And it could be that before you actually had the same requirements or very similar requirements for those two regions. So it's an exercise that you have to do and redo every time that you want to make changes. So again, plan and prioritize, adapt your QMS based on the changes that you want to make, and prepare your documentation. Also here, it's important to consider that you will, you have your first certification, but you will also have to go through recertifications. And the timelines for that are also not the same in every region of the world. So it might actually be important to look at that as well, the time that it takes to obtain a recertification, and the planning in terms of when you first got your initial certificate and when recertification is due. And that might also affect your regulatory planning and strategy in terms of making changes as well. And don't forget that, in fact, the regulatory strategy, why would you build or try to build an effective regulatory strategy? It's to enable patient access to your device in a fast and efficient way. That's why you want to make why you want to do the exercise, why you want to really plan carefully and take into account all these different aspects to bring that device to a market in a fast and efficient way. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. So the key takeaways that I hope you will get from my talk is that, first of all, it's important to build a regulatory strategy, and that you actually have to start early. It's already important to know from the very beginning, when you are developing that idea of creating a solution for a specific problem, what are the regulatory requirements and how can I plan them efficiently. But it's also very important to realize that those requirements will change over time. The regulations change over time, your company changes over time, and the products change over time. And all three will have an impact on that strategy. The regulatory strategy covers the entire life cycle of a product. So from the design phase up to post-market changes. So also there, whenever there are changes there, you have to review the strategy and make sure that it still fits with what you want to do. And when you keep that end goal in mind, the regulatory strategy will give you a framework for your development and make sure that you can bring your medical device to the market in an efficient way without neglecting the business needs. So that's it from me. I'm happy to answer the questions.
Thank you so much, Anne, for an excellent presentation. We have received a few questions already, but I will give you the rest of your moment to enter your question in the Q&A box to the left of the slides. Before we begin the Q&A, I will run through some brief announcements. First, I would like to thank Sanvia Matrix Requirements ARC Regulatory Limited for sponsoring this digital week. Next, I would like to inform you that our Medtech Summit US event will take place in Minneapolis from November 14th to 16th, and our flagship European event, Medtech Summit, will be returning to Brussels in June 2024. Now, back one to begin the Q&A. So we have already some questions. The first one, Anne, can you please elaborate on starting the strategy with the end in mind? I think that
sure.
This question, you were between the slide 10 and slide 12.
Yes, so what I mean with keeping the end in mind is when you are doing this whole exercise of building a regulatory strategy, you have to know what you want to achieve, meaning the target markets, so the regions, but also what does my device need to do? What are the claims that I want to make, me as a manufacturer? You should not forget that you as a manufacturer are responsible for defining the intended use, the intended user, the intended patient population, the intended use environment, and so on. That it's you that is in control of that. And based on what you define as being the intended use of your device and the claims that you want to make, that will actually impact everything that comes further down the road, meaning the classification, the risk classification in each of the different regions. And based on that classification, you will have your documentation requirements. So that's what I mean with having the end in mind, knowing well when I bring my product to the market, what are the claims that I want to make? What is, let's say, the framework? What are the barriers of the use of my device?
Thank you, Anne. We have another question from Albert. Great presentation. Thanks. Are there any templates you can recommend for the regulatory strategy plan? Something similar to the IMBRF, EMA, TOC?
Unfortunately, I don't really have a template for a regulatory strategy plan. And I think it's really difficult to make a generic template for that, because you have so many different medical devices out there, and they all have their specific things to consider. The planning for example, bringing a hardware product to the market is completely different than a software product. And that's because you have this whole set of requirements related to manufacturing lines and the validation of manufacturing processes that is very different in terms of hardware versus software. In general, what I would advise there is to really think of it as project plan. So listing all the different stakeholders in this plan, so all the different departments involved, and then really start looking at their needs and linking that to the regulatory requirements. So to make it a little bit more concrete, you start with the design and development. You know what you're heading for in terms of claims and expected documentation. So you really have to think about and plan there what are the documents that I need to generate and what are the testing requirements, for example. And based on that, you can start planning this effort. If there is a transfer to manufacturing afterwards, you have to really think, okay, what does my manufacturing site look like? What is the validation that is needed? How long does it take to do that validation? Because I will have to have a certain number of prototypes coming out of it that I can use for my testing. So that links back to the testing efforts. And like this, you can build it. But unfortunately, there is no generic template for a whole regulatory strategy because, yeah, first of all, it depends on the product. And then secondly, on which markets you will target.
Thank you, Anne. What role does collaboration between regulatory teams and other departments play in implementing an effective strategic planning structure for ensuring compliance in the medtech industry?
I think it's of vital importance. If you do not have a good collaboration between the different departments within the company, it's impossible to gather all the information. As I mentioned during my talk, RAQA, or regulatory affairs alone, is not sitting there on an island and gathering regulatory requirements. No, in order to build an effective strategy, you really have to have a close collaboration with your development, with your manufacturing, with your marketing, with your sales, with all the different departments and stakeholders within the company to know what are their needs and how does that link to the regulatory requirements, in this case, to build that strategy. Because it might just be that in order to make sure that everything is ready to enter a certain market, it takes much more time than what, for example, sales had in mind, but they have another market that is actually easier to enter in terms of documentation, which has a shorter timeline for approval. So that might just shift the planning on that front. Same thing when we talk about development, there is a very close link between the regulatory affairs with their requirements coming from the different regions and what is expected in terms of development, strict requirements, also the documentation that goes with it. So without a good collaboration, I think it's very hard to actually successfully bring any device to the market.
How can medtech startups and scale-ups implement a proactive approach to regulatory affairs to be compliant while navigating the complexities of rapid growth?
That's a very interesting question. Especially startup companies change pretty fast. And I think what is important is to have a dedicated resource, whether it's internal or external in form of consultant or anything, that actually knows quite well how to get the information that is needed. So where to find those regulatory requirements and how to navigate the regulatory landscape. I think that is actually a very useful thing to consider from the start as well, even though I get it that for smaller companies, resources are even more limited than for bigger ones. But having someone with some experience and knowledge about how to obtain the information, how to deal with certain regulatory requirements, somebody who has some experience as well in entering some markets, that is actually a huge advantage, because they will be able to guide you. Maybe they have some experience on how to deal with certain requirements that you don't necessarily automatically have when you just read the requirements. So I think that's a very good investment for companies of any size, to have somebody to help them to understand and to navigate the regulatory landscape depending on what regions that they want to target.
Any advice on getting RA on board in the early stages when the what is known, intended use and purpose, but the how is not fully defined, and keep that each through the development phase, which might last years?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sure.
So yeah, no, I think I got it. So the getting RA on board in the early stages can actually be a very interesting way to defining the how as well. If you have a regulatory consultant that can give you an insight, if, for example, if you're still trying to define an intended use and you have, let's say, different possibilities, you're not sure where you want to go, it might be very interesting to have somebody with the right knowledge to actually tell you, if you make that decision, if you go in that direction, these will be the consequences. If you have a certain intended use, it might actually be that you become, if we talk about Europe, for example, a class 2A product. If you add this, it might actually become a class 3 product with all the consequences in terms of resources needed, requirements in terms of clinical evaluation, the documentation, the timelines, and so on. So actually, in my opinion, if you ask me, if you have the resources, it's very useful that even in this very early stage to get the advice of an expert to know what would be the consequence depending on what choices that you make in terms then of timelines and expectations from authorities.
Thank you. And in the context of the fast-paced medtech industry, can you share examples of best practices that have successfully expedited the certification process, allowing companies to achieve compliance faster?
Well, in order to achieve compliance faster, of course, there are no real shortcuts. You have to, I will already destroy that bubble. There are no shortcuts in the process. What can help and what is important is to do that exercise of building that regulatory strategy and of doing that research on what are the actual requirements, I think that is actually what will help you most. Taking the time to know what is expected, and then with a good planning, work through the different requirements. And I've mentioned this before during the talk, and I want to emphasize it again. It's not only about the product documentation, it's also your QMS. Sometimes we do see that people have put a lot of effort in the development of a solution, but their quality management system is lacking. And then just before they want to go for certification, they want to quickly do the minimum to get that QMS in place, or all of a sudden they become aware of certain expectations in terms of documentation or control of documentation that they didn't know in advance, and that is actually causing more delays than the actual process. So the one golden tip in this whole process is taking the time to do the research up front of what are the expectations, and maybe also to focus on a limited set of regions to start with. But that, of course, depends on the resources and the possibilities of your organization.
Elaborate on the key components required for establishing a robust strategic plan in the Medtech scale-up process.
So the key components required for establishing the regulatory strategy are, first of all, knowing what will be your intended use and your claims, knowing your markets, and knowing what is expected from your users. Those are the foundations. And then it's also a matter of providing the resources. Again, it can be somebody internal, can be external help, but providing the resources, making sure that you have someone or a small team, depending, that can do that exercise and make sure that everything is aligned, so that the collaboration between the different departments is also in place. Everybody is aware of what are the requirements and what are the expected timelines. So that it all starts with the first building blocks, meaning knowing what you want to do, where you want to do it, and what is expected from those markets in order to bring devices to the market.
Thank you. What are some specific proven methods that can be employed to enhance a Medtech company certification strategy effectively?
Specific proven methods. Well, when you are building a certification strategy, what you can do is also you have to make sure that your planning is covering the different requirements. So what I mentioned it in one of the previous questions, what I would recommend is not to target too many things at once, unless those different requirements for the different markets are very similar. I think it's actually much more efficient to go for one or two markets first, especially when you're a smaller company and it's the first time you want to do that, and you have to build all the documentation from scratch. I think it's much more efficient to target one region first and then in parallel build the documentation for other regions. But to really focus on one region first, make sure that you have everything in place, and then knowing the similarities and the differences, it will be much easier to actually extend your documentation and make those adaptations to enter the next market.
Thank you, Anne. It looks like that was the last question. So thank you again for a great presentation. This session was recorded, so you all receive a notification in 24 hours when the on-demand session is available for viewing. For you love, please take a moment to complete the feedback form so we can continue to improve your digital week experience. And on behalf of Informa Connect Life Sciences, have a great day to everyone.
Thank you very much.